Okay, thanks for tuning in. This is an ongoing test. Right now, I'm sharing some prophecy charts, but I wanted to make sure I could share my screen. I had to shut down my Chrome. I just got a brand new MacBook. So I got everything installed, but I'm still learning some of the features. So I had to shut down Chrome, then I had to relaunch it again, but I'm back. I will be sharing some prophecy charts tonight. We're going to be going over these again. I know I did these a while, several months ago. I opened up one of these charts and I kind of explained it in as best and as articulate a way as I could, with the 7,000 years and all of that. But I want to go through them a little bit more, and I just want to hit some of the main indicators because I am going to be doing a debate with Steve Gregg in 2 weeks. It's going to be over at Donnie Badinsky's channel, and as a matter of fact, let me go ahead and share that with you. So Steve Gregg, this is going to be a rather interesting debate because Steve, he has, he's one of the top guns, I guess you would say, in the debate world. He's been a minister for years. He runs a radio show. He answers Bible questions and all of that. And so it's going to be a very, very good debate. I'm sure there's going to be some interesting points brought out on both sides. And one of the things I think that's really going to be intriguing about this debate is that Steve is a partial preterist. So he holds to a literal view of the time texts. So he's not going to be one of those guys who says, oh, the time text, soon doesn't mean, at hand in the lifetime of the original audience. It means, potentially it could mean, 2,000 years. He's not going to be making those arguments as far as I know. Now, he may make some of those arguments. I'm not sure. But as far as I know from what I've heard him say in other videos, he does hold to the time frame indicators. At the same time, he's a millennial. And so this should be really interesting, hearing these arguments and then seeing how they interface with my own understanding of eschatology, which I'll just be skipping through tonight. It's not going to be a very long video. Like I said, it's just going to be, testing. It's really just testing equipment. But I'm looking forward to it. And so that's going to be over at Donnie Badinsky's channel. That's going to be on May 10th. I believe it's going to be at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time. And so please put your notifications on, tap the notification button so that you're alerted prior to the beginning of the debate. It's going to be a debate to remember, I'm sure. Anyways, what I want to do is I want to go through this prophecy chart here. And I've actually got 3 prophecy charts. So the first one I designed, I want to say it was last year, or it was a couple of years ago, but it's based on research that I've been doing for the past 20 years, not only as a former preterist, but as someone who has deeply studied eschatological literature, whether it be dispensational, whether it be preteristic. I've read a lot of the classics of theology from both camps, and I started to integrate my theological positions. The more I read, differing views, I didn't, hold like a third approach where it's like, okay, well, you got this camp over here, and then you got this camp over here, and now I want to come up with something entirely new that's contradictory to both. But I started to integrate my theological understanding where it's like, okay, I could see that person's perspective now. Whereas before I had been like, well, preterism, that can't possibly be true. And then on the other hand, well, dispensationalism, that can't possibly be true. I started to listen more to what people were saying, not only in podcasts and YouTube videos and whatnot, but also in books, theological books. And so I started to integrate my position, and it wasn't premeditated at all. It was just something that just developed over the years. Anyways, but a lot of it had to do with studying the church fathers. And the church fathers, I think, really gave me a new, shed some new light on the study of eschatology, because I had always been taught, well, the church fathers, they were all Catholic, and well, the arguments. And that was, of course, proven false when I started reading the church fathers for myself. So I think it was a good thing that I did that. But what I've got right here is I've got a chart that is basically, it's showing the redemptive week of 1,000 years, 1,000 year days rather. And you'll find this in Irenaeus, you'll find this in Lactantius, you'll find this in some of the other, pre-Nicene fathers, where they held that, let me blow this up, where they held that there was, 7 days, right? 7 days of 1,000 years each. And my studies have led me to hold that this redemptive week, it began on the day that Adam sinned, and so sacrifice was instituted in Genesis chapter 3 verse 21, and so that's when this age began. And that was, of course, the first Adam. He brought ruin upon the human race, and then we have the other side here, which is showing in the millennium, second Adam restoration. But you see that this redemptive week, it extends all the way from the fall of Adam all the way through until the millennium is over, where you have this phrase in the New Testament, eis ton aeona, to the age, but then you have the ages of the ages mentioned. And so, if you start reading, really, really deeply reading, dispensational literature, and I'm not talking about like, Schofield and Darby. I'm talking about, you have to go to guys like Bullinger and, A.E. Nock. They'll always make a distinction between this age to come and then ages of the ages. And I think A.E. Nock, well, he was a more or less of a universalist, but he brought this out in some of his books, which I would recommend, except he did hold some really weird views, which are, they're considered heterodox, but of course, just chew up the meat, spit out the bones, that sort of thing. Anyways, this chart here, it shows the redemptive week, but then it also shows over here, it shows the two dispensations, one of Moses and then the other one of Christ. And so you have between these dispensations, you have what theologians will call an overlap. And there's a lot of literature on this, whether it be preterist or whether it be dispensationalist. I think partial preterists also hold this idea of an overlap between the dispensations. So starting with AD 26, with the ministry of John the Baptist, that's when you have him preaching that the kingdom is at hand. And of course, he's talking about the Davidic kingdom. He's talking about the physical, literal Davidic kingdom, because that's what Israel was. Israel was a physical kingdom, except the throne was vacant. And so you needed somebody with the right blood, not only the right bloodline, but the legitimate lineage to inherit the throne. And so John the Baptist, he was preaching that the kingdom of heaven was at hand. It goes all the way back to the Old Testament, with the kingdom of heaven being the Davidic reign of Jesus Christ, which was offered to Israel during this 40 years. I think it's really important to keep that in mind, that it was being offered to Israel. Of course, there was another aspect to that. There was a condition to that, and that was righteousness. And, if the kingdom will come, if you'll be righteous, if you'll fulfill this standard of righteousness, then the kingdom will be established. The Old Testament prophets, they mentioned this again and again and again. And we know that Israel failed to achieve that standard of righteousness. And that, of course, is when I believe the kingdom was established in its spiritual form, because the kingdom isn't just about sonship. Now, restoration of sonship was important. It was extremely important that sonship be restored, because that's one of the things that humanity lost in Adam after Adam fell, was sonship. At the same time, though, there's governmental righteousness that was lost. There was anthropological conformity to the image of God that was lost. And so there's other things that need to be restored, not just sonship. So to make the kingdom only about sonship is, I think, a colossal mistake. Now, during this 40 years, or actually it's 44, the prior to the cross, the law of the new covenant was proclaimed by Christ. That's the law made spiritual. And so he's showing the true spiritual nature and intent of the law. And he's, in the Sermon on the Mount, if you read that, you'll find that he's giving the true spiritual intent of the law. So he's not only talking about external acts, he's talking about internal motives as well. And this was one of the things that Israel was commanded to do, was they were commanded to not only cleanse their outer actions, but their hearts as well, their purposes, their motives. And of course, in hindsight, we find that Jesus Christ, he actually had to die as a sacrifice for sin before this righteousness, this internal righteousness could be achieved. And that, of course, was made effectual on the day of Pentecost. We're kind of getting ahead of ourselves, because one of the main points of this, or I should say, one of the more salient characteristics of this period is that the new covenant was being mediated by apostles. And so after the cross, we have from Acts to AD 70, the new covenant was mediated by the apostles. You couldn't just, believe in Jesus Christ. You had to accept the new covenant through the apostles. They laid hands on you and imparted the spiritual gifts. And then afterwards, we know, of course, that the gifts fell upon the Gentiles through no other, through no mediation, through no other instrumentality other than faith. But this was a progressive, dispensation. So the kingdom was at hand, and the ministry of the 12 was associated with Israel's kingdom program. So Israel's kingdom program, remember I said that the Davidic kingdom was being offered to Israel during this period of time. And so that's Israel's kingdom program. And the 12 were basically going out and they were trying to get the Jews saved so that this eschaton could be triggered, because, you need a first fruits in order to seal the harvest. You need a first fruits. And so during this 40 years, there was a first fruits number that was being built. But it was a very iffy thing, because there were Jews that were trying to go back to the law. There were false teachers that were starting to come in and trying to pull disciples away. And then at the end of this period, there was a huge apostasy among professing Israelites who had accepted Christianity, but who later fell away. And so when Paul goes to Jerusalem, I think for the very last time before he's thrown in prison, James tells him there's many thousands of Jews which believe and are zealous of the law, but we need you to not oppose the law like you're doing, at least, nominally, because we need that, this number has to be filled up. They were laboring for the hope of Israel, which I think, the hope of Israel is obviously the Davidic kingdom. And one passage from Luke, which I think is really, really important, because a lot of folks will say, well, the kingdom changes when you get to the New Testament. Everything changes, definitions change, meaning of words change, theological categories change. Well, I don't hold that view. I hold that everything remains the same. As a matter of fact, in Luke chapter 1, it simply says, well, let's just go to verse 69. I'm not going to read the whole passage. It says, "And hath raised up an horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David, as he spake by the mouth of his holy prophets, which have been since the world began, that we should be saved from our enemies and from the hand of all that hate us, to perform the mercy promised to our fathers, and to remember his holy covenant, the oath which he sware to our father Abraham." Now look at verse 74. "That he would grant unto us that we, being delivered out of the hand of our enemies, might serve him without fear and holiness and righteousness before him all the days of our life." So this is talking about an earthly, the days of our life are spent on earth. Talking about being delivered from the hands of our enemies. This is not, this is geopolitical nature. This is not something that's just a restoration of sonship, something that you could just spiritualize and say, oh, well, this is just about sonship. This is something that's like, yeah, like destruction of the enemies of God and the establishment of the kingdom, the establishments, the reinstitution, or I should say, the restoration of governmental righteousness. So, really important, I think, to recognize that. And so well, first of all, let's talk about Paul a little bit, because Paul, during the first part of his ministry, he proclaims the kingdom to the Jew first. And then, after Acts 28:28, that's when he began to reveal these ages to come. He began to reveal that there was an interim period during which the kingdom would be in abeyance. And during this time, everything would be made spiritual. So this would be the gathering in of the Gentiles. Where the Jews would be in dispersion, the Gentiles would be called to participate in Israel's covenantal privileges. That's pretty much spelled out in the book of Ephesians. You have drawn nigh, all of that. So Acts 28:28, that's really where the turning point comes in, as to where you start to see Israel's kingdom program ramping down. Now with the 12, they actually, I believe they actually stayed right up to the very end, to the last hour. They actually continued to try to get as many Jews saved as they could. Of course, they were pretty much, James was killed, and, Jude, I don't know what happened to him, but a lot of them, were martyred before the fall of Jerusalem. But they, up to the 11th hour, their ministry was for the Jews. And then Paul, of course, he starts to minister to the Gentiles after Acts 28:28 without, Jew first. Is basically, he just starts, ministering to the Gentiles after Acts 28:28. Now, he had been ministering to the Gentiles before, but the Jews were always given priority. Remember, prior to Acts 28, the book of Romans was written. He says, to the Jew first. So if you look at the epistles that Paul writes after Acts 28, you'll find that he was no longer going to the Jew first. He was basically saying there's no difference between Jew and Greek. We're on the same standing and everything like that. Something that I'll have to flesh out another time, because there's a lot to that. But some people don't understand there is a difference between Paul's earlier and later epistles. And Bullinger, E.W. Bullinger, he got into this, and he really, really did some great research on it. And I think his book is just amazing, because it goes through this, this period that we're talking about here between, say, AD 26 and AD 70. It goes through all of the epistles one by one. It shows how Israel's hope was paramount throughout this period. And then it shows how everything was kind of put on hold when you get to Acts 28, which is really, it's connected with AD 70. So AD 70 is when you go from, the kingdom being at hand to now we're in this dispensation of 2,000 years and counting, where we don't see things like miracles and sign gifts and stuff like that anymore. I know there's like Catholics and people that'll talk about, statues of Mary crying and all these miraculous miracles. But we don't know for sure if that's something that's true. We don't see those things anymore. We believe that those are pretty much the stuff of legend. So I just want to point that out, that this is the reason why we have a dispensation of silence. Let's see. So we get to this age. We have the dispensation of the mystery. We have the ages of Ephesians 2.7. We have the Great Commission being fulfilled. We've got parables of Matthew 13. We've got the natural branches, the broken off. No apostolic mediation needed. Many being made righteous. And so you basically have classic Christianity coming in here. After AD 70, this is when the Great Commission goes out, when they start to baptize all nations in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit. Whereas during the Acts, they were baptizing in the name of Jesus. They weren't following that baptismal formula in the book of Acts. So again, a lot of stuff to get into. I can only just skim right through it. But when you get to the end of the church age, because I had to crowd a lot of stuff in here, right now we're in the present church age. But when you get towards the end of the church age, that's when you have the Gentile branches broken off. So you have Romans 11, verses 20 and 21, where it talks about the natural, or the Gentile, if they don't remain faithful, they're going to be broken off too. And then at some point afterwards, and so, okay, so here's where you have the apostasy, which Paul talked about in his last epistles to Timothy. He says in the latter days. So they were in the latter days during the book of Acts. We know that because it said during these days, all this stuff was happening. This is what the prophets wrote about, et cetera, et cetera. And then when you get to Paul's last epistles, he issues these prophecies are like in the latter days, some will depart from doctrine. He's talking about the end of the church age. So what happened is right in here, that's when there was a break and the last days were tacked on to the end of the church age. That's why in Paul's last epistles, in his 2 epistles to Timothy, that's why the last days are future again. They're not in the last days anymore when he wrote those epistles. Now they're at the end of the church age. So he had already revealed these ages to come. He had already, where he had said in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, he had said, and this was prior to Acts 28, he had said, the ends of the ages have come upon us. Well, after Acts 28, he starts talking about ages to come. Well, what's that all about? That I thought they were at the ends of the ages. Well, there was a change in Acts 28. And so this is why you have to understand that, if you look at it in a linear, fashion where it's like everything's just linear, there's no breaks, there's no pauses. God puts something on the conveyor belt. It never stops. It reaches its destination. Somehow it may not reach it in the form that it was originally delivered, as far as hermeneutics and grammar and text and context and all that. But they'll say that it came to the end of the conveyor belt. It was slightly damaged goods, but it reached the end of the conveyor belt. I'm saying no. I'm saying the goods that were put on the conveyor belt, they never reached the end of the conveyor belt. That's why we're looking for these things to happen. That's why we're still looking for the second coming of Christ, because if you read the New Testament, the second coming of Christ was placed in the lifetime of the original audience. It wasn't placed 2,000 years in the future. However, when we get past Acts 28, that's when we start to see more of a long-term thing start to creep into the writings. And that's of course, really important to keep in mind. Now, when you get to this apostasy, that's when the Jews, so with the Gentiles being broken off, that's where the Jews get grafted back in again, because God's going to return to the church, to the Jews. The church is a Jewish institution. There's no way around it. It was intended to be a Jewish institution. Christ instituted the new covenant, with actually it was 11 Jewish apostles, right? And so they were sitting at the table when Christ instituted the new covenant. It was not instituted with Gentiles. It was promised to Israel back in Jeremiah. And so how did the Gentiles, how did we come into this? Well, we came into this because of what happened in the first century with Jews rejecting the gospel of the kingdom. And then, of course, the gospel of the grace of God being preached subsequent to that. And of course, that's what we have today. That's what we have. We have a present church age, which is basically is what you see is what you get. I mean, and is no miracles. There's no, the sign gifts are in a very, if they still exist, it's debatable who has them or how to get them. I don't personally believe, I believe they still exist, but I don't believe they exist as a general dispensation. I think they're only very special circumstances will bring those about. Anyways, don't want to beat a dead horse, but when we get to the Daniel's 70th week, we see that the Jewish branches are grafted back in. And so Revelation chapter 7, that's where you have this latter rain revival in Jerusalem. It's another Pentecost. And then they're the ones who maintain the faith, because by this point, Christendom has become so apostate that God will just no longer deal with Gentiles anymore. Whereas there'll be a revival within the confines of the Jewish nation, where they will start having these gifts again. They will start going out and preaching. They will start doing the missionary work. They will start doing the, saving people. They will start warning people of the coming judgment. They will start doing these miracles. They will start preaching the gospel of the kingdom again. And then at the end of this period, of course, at the end of the last half of the 70th week, you have the 666, you have the end of the sixth day. So this goes back again to the redemptive week, 666. And you could read Irenaeus. He talks about, 666 being a culmination of all the apostasy and iniquity that ever was from the foundation of the world until, it's a concentration of man's day. It comes in at the very end. And then when Christ comes, when he returns, that's where you have this redemptive Sabbath. There's a Sabbath keeping. I think in Hebrews chapter 4:9, the Greek word is sabbatismos. It means a keeping of a Sabbath. And we can't go into that. Again, that's something that we can't go into. But I think this chart right here explains everything. On the other hand, now I've got another chart, so I want to show that briefly. Let me just get rid of this. Let's see. Let's see. Okay, so let me go ahead and pull this one up. I'm going to stop the screen share. And now what I'm going to do is this one over here, this one is actually, this one shows in better detail exactly what was going on during that period, during that crisis, which culminated in the destruction of Jerusalem. Let me go ahead and present that. Here we go. Okay, so what's going on in this chart, let me just make sure that this is showing. Okay, good, and I will expand this. So what's going on in this chart is, this is talking about Daniel's 70th week. So there was, as Donnie Badinsky pointed out in his book, Antichrist Revealed, he made a really great point. He said there was a shadow week actually during the Jewish-Roman War. It was a 7-year war, and it started in AD 66 and it ended in AD 73. Well, it's during this period that we have things really reaching a crisis in Jerusalem, where I believe Christ could have come, the parousia could have happened. And so this ties in with the book of Revelation, because let me go ahead and expand this. So my understanding is that there was a shadow week, as it says right here, a shadow week of 7 years took place during the first Jewish-Roman war from AD 66 to 73. In the middle of the week, AD 70, Titus came and destroyed the city and the sanctuary, taking away the daily sacrifices. So if you go back to Daniel, you'll find that the abomination of desolation is set up at the same time, always at the same time that the daily sacrifice is taken away. So whoever removes the daily sacrifice is supposed to also set up the abomination of desolation. And we know that precursive fulfillments, shadow fulfillments, call them what you will, we know that not all the constituent elements of a prophecy are fulfilled at the same time. Sometimes you'll have one element of the prophecy fulfilled at one time, like say a prophecy concerning the first advent, and then at a subsequent time where you'll see no gap in the text, but you'll find that at a later point, maybe hundreds of years down the road, or in the case of the second coming, 2000 and counting, where the prophecy is fulfilled. So that's what we call partial fulfillment. Well, I'm wondering if this was a case of partial fulfillment, because you have the book of Revelation was written in, I believe, AD 68. During this time, during this first half of the shadow week, and it culminates this half culminates in Titus stopping the daily sacrifices. So he came to destroy the city and the sanctuary, taking away the daily sacrifices. And then I wrote the 42-month Great Tribulation, which never took place in the first century, will be set into motion once the Philadelphian saints are caught up. This coincides with the revelation of man of sin and setting up of the abomination of desolation in the most holy place. So when we look at Revelation chapter 17, verse 10, and we find out, 5 are fallen and one is, and the other is not yet come, he's talking about you have to go back and you have to look at the Roman emperors, because the first Roman emperor was Augustus. And then you get to Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero. Nero had just died, and John was expecting him to be resurrected from the dead. He said, he is about to rise from the bottomless pit, because there was a belief within the Roman Empire, and you can read this in Suetonius, that Nero wasn't truly dead. He was either away, in some other land, in hiding, or he's going to come back. Well, when you read some of the early ecclesiastical writers like Sulpicius Severus, and I believe even Augustine mentions this, said that they thought that he was dead, but he was going to come back to life. And so that's what I believe the book of Revelation is about. John's writing right in this, during this first half of the 70th week, he's writing to the churches. And if you look at this letters to the 7 churches, he's writing, behold, some of you are going to be cast into great tribulation. Be on guard, watch, because I come like a thief. Well, had Titus fulfilled all of the criteria that was necessary in order to bring about the Great Tribulation, then yes, that would have happened. Christ would have come in AD 70. There would have been a catching up of those who were watching and waiting, those who remained faithful. So that would have been the Philadelphian rapture, right? Because he said, I will give you an open door. And then in Revelation chapter 4, you see that open door, come up hither, you hear the sound of a trumpet, and that's where you see the 24 elders. Again, this is something that I can't get into now. I'll have to flesh this out at a later point. But what happened was Titus, he never actually, there was no abomination of desolation. There was a cessation of the daily sacrifices, but there was no abomination of desolation. And so that's the reason why the Great Tribulation wasn't fulfilled, and that's the reason why there was no second coming of Christ in the first century. Now, what should have happened in AD 70 had Titus actually placed the abomination of desolation in the holy place, which would have been caused by Nero rising from the dead, and then the Jewish religious leaders would have been telling Christians to worship him, etc. That would have triggered the eschaton. And then you would have had all the events spoken of from Revelation chapter 4 through 19 taking place within this second half of 42 months, because I believe everything from Revelation chapter 4 to Revelation chapter 19 takes place in the last half of the week. I don't believe in this idea of the tribulation being a 7-year period. That's very confusing. But I want to say this, that the seals, trumpets, and vials, would have taken place, and they still are future. But one of the points that I'd like to make here, if I can just, let me see if I can find out what happens to my bar. Well, maybe let me just go ahead and, all right, let me do this. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get down to the bottom of this, because I want to show. Okay, so what you have right here is you have the fulfillment, and then you have the present church age, and then of course you have at the end of this church age the conditions, the spiritual conditions of the first century churches are revived. So you have a situation similar to what existed in the first century, and then that's when the abomination of desolation and man of sin are truly revealed. And then when that happens, that's when the seals, the trumpets, and the violin begin to be played out. So I said at the bottom, I said, seals and the trumpets are synchronous and take place last half of Daniel's 70th week. The seven vials unfold from the seventh trumpet. In the days when the seventh trumpet begins to sound, Matthew chapter 24, verse 31, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 16 to 17, 1 Corinthians 15, 52 will be fulfilled, and then the church will be complete. Remember, in the days when the seventh angel begins to sound, the mystery of God will be completed. So I take that to mean the church. And when you have the seventh trumpet, the seven vials unfold from the seventh trumpet, and that's the very end. And then, of course, you have this period of 30 plus 45 days at the very end of the Great Tribulation. And that's when, of course, you have the Battle of Armageddon. You have the judgment of Gentile nations mentioned in Revelation 19, Zechariah 14, Joel 3, and Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 to 46. So again, it's something that, when we go back to the first chart, you'll find that when I mentioned the 70th week, I didn't mention really the mechanics that were happening in the first century. But this chart right here, this actually gives the actual mechanics, the timing mechanics in the first century from a first century perspective. So if you assume, as I do, that Revelation was written in AD 68, shortly after Nero's death, you can see how all of this starts to make sense. In AD 66, Cestius Gallus retreated from Jerusalem. The Jews, or the Christian population, they fled to Pella. And that, a lot of people will say, well, that was the rapture. That was that's when the saints were caught up in the air. But if you look closely at the timeline, you'll find that's not the case. The saints are caught up in the air. Well, there's a preliminary catching up in the middle, at around the middle of the 70th week. We find that from Revelation chapter 12, where it's talking about the woman, and it's talking about the man-child that's being caught up. Something for another podcast, perhaps. I'd like to hear what other people think about that, but I think that is a preliminary catching up, because there's going to be those who are watching and waiting, and who receive that promise of being sheltered from the Great Tribulation. And then there's, of course, those who have to go through it, and then they have to stand their ground and resist the mark of the beast and all that. So that's my second chart. The last chart is only going to take like a minute or two. Let me see. Okay, so stop screen share. So the last chart, this one right here, shows the two ages. And when I mention two ages, I mean not the two-age system that, say, like an amillennialist will hold, but the two ages, the two eschatons. So let me go ahead and let's see. Here we go. Okay, so this chart right here is actually showing the two eschatons of the New Testament. So viewed from the historic standpoint of the New Testament writings, if you were to look at the New Testament writings from, say, the standpoint of, I don't know, the cross, or just shortly after the cross, you would see that the end of the Mosaic age and the end of the Adamic age, they're packaged together. Not only is the Mosaic age about to end, but the Adamic age is also about to end, and all things, second coming is about to happen, and all things are going to be fulfilled. Well, hidden in God's purpose was this present church age, which, again, you could say that the church, was predicted in the Old Testament. There's some types in there and everything like that. I don't want to get into that. That's another controversy for another time. But the present age we're living in now, the present dispensation we're living in now, which started, I believe, in AD 70, that is not predicted in the Old Testament. Now, there's things that apply to that from the Old Testament that apply to this age. There's things like from the prophets Isaiah, talking about righteousness. And there's things that apply to this age. And even Irenaeus, he understood that things apply to this age, that things can be apply to the present conditions of the church, etc. But what we want to do is we want to be very scrupulous about reading into, reading the Old Testament scriptures into this present age, unless we actually are doing it on solid exegetical grounds. So, present church age. So what happens is when you get to say Acts 28, that's when you start to see this period open up. In other words, it's not a Christ is going to come at any time sort of thing anymore. Now it's like, okay, well, we got ages to come. We've got things to do. Christianity needs to go out to the nations. The church is. The church has to do its job in discipling all nations, and so again, that puts this end of this Adamic eschaton necessarily off to it depends. Well, I guess it depends what your historic standpoint is, but to the distant future. Although I don't believe it's so distant now as it was in the earlier centuries. But you have this present, so you have AD 70 over here. You have the end of the Mosaic age, which truly did happen in AD 70. Then you have the present church age. But what happened was, if you look at this chart, is you'll find that the Mosaic age, the end of the Mosaic age, got unpackaged from the end of the Adamic age. See, they were packaged together. And then once you get beyond Acts 28, that's when you see them get unpackaged. So again, I think that's really important to bear in mind. And this chart right here, this is just showing. I think I used this in my debate with Tommy McMurtry just to show, because we were talking about the Olivet Discourse, and I wanted to show that in the Olivet Discourse, he's talking about the end of the age, but he's talking about the end of the Adamic age. Now, there is implied, I believe. Okay, so in Luke 21, I believe that also includes teachings concerning the end of the Mosaic age, but they weren't packaged with like a 2,000-year gap, is what I'm saying. How they got separated was because the original hope of Israel that was being proclaimed during that 40 years was rejected by the Jews. God used that rejection to open up the door of faith to the Gentiles. Marriage was postponed, the parousia was postponed, and so the Gentiles, they get the spiritual blessings of the new covenant now, forgiveness of sins, all of that. And the eschatological things that didn't happen in the first century, well, they didn't just fall off the conveyor belt. They're still going to be fulfilled at some point in the future. So again, these three charts here are, have been very helpful from my studies. I've had people, write me, email me asking for them, and I send them in the highest resolution I can because they're good to study. And again, this is based on like 20 years of research and reading on eschatology. I'm not pulling stuff out of a hat. I mean, I can, I'm defending all of this on a debate floor. I'm doing the best I can to articulate these concepts, which again, not a lot of people believe in anymore in this day and age. And we've got a lot of people with weak faith. But anyways, that's pretty much it. Oh, here we go. A comment from SoCal Preston. He says, geopolitically in nature. I like that when discussing Luke 1. Yeah. So SoCal and I, we hold a lot of similar views. In fact, he's a great teacher. And hopefully have him on the show more often, because I think he's got a lot to contribute. And he's also the one who got me really interested in the Apocrypha. So we'll have to corral back around and do another podcast soon. But anyways, I wanted to thank everybody for tuning in. Hopefully everything works okay. Like I said, I'm just trying out this new MacBook, trying everything out, making sure everything's good. And I'm going to watch it afterwards just to make sure there's no glitches or anything like that. But I wanted to thank you for tuning in. And I also want to remind you to stay tuned for that debate over at Donnie Bedinsky's channel on May 10th. It's between myself and Steve Gregg. We'll be talking about amillennialism versus premillennialism. Hope to see you before then.